So I was tasked with discussing the role of the young urologist or the millennial urologist. These are my disclosures, non-irrelevant. My objectives, so first define what a millennial is, who the millennials are as a group, how that fits with the practice of urology, and then talk about future leadership. Okay, so audience response question. What is a millennial? Someone born after the year 2000, someone between the ages of 18 and 35 currently, a rare coin, or someone who has driven the Millennium Falcon. Okay, so most people got it right. It's number 2. So what is the Millennial Generation? William Strauss and Neil Howe describe a theory of recurring generation cycles in American history. A social generation is made up of a group of people born over a span of roughly 20 years, or about the length of one stage of life: childhood, young adulthood, midlife, etc. Generation is defined by 3 characteristics. Their age, location, and history, i.e. they'll encounter key historic events at a roughly the same stage in their life. They share common beliefs and behaviors, and they have a perceived membership in that group. So the Millennial Generation applies to individuals who are coming into adulthood at the turn of the century, so born between about 1980 to 2005, which would make them roughly 18 to 35 years old today. Prior generations would be Generation X, the baby boomers, the silent generation, and then prior generations would be the GI generation, lost generation according to Ernest Hemingway, or the lost generation, the greatest generation according to Tom Brokaw. Today, 32% of US adults are millennials. They surpassed the baby boomers in 2016 as the largest population group, 75 to 80 million Americans, and it's expected to make up 50% of the US workforce by 2020. So traits attributed to millennials by Strauss and Howe include special, sheltered, confident, team-oriented, pressured, and achieving. And these are based on a historical repeating cycle, and based on the cycle, they predicted the millennials would share traits with the civic-minded GI generation. Personality surveys of millennials identified traits of confidence and tolerance, but also entitlement and narcissism. So this may hold some selection bias, as the millennials assessed tend to be white, affluent teenagers who accomplish great things as they grow up in the suburbs, who confront anxiety when applying to super selective colleges, and who multitask with ease as their helicopter parents hover reassuringly above them. This may not accurately reflect other socioeconomic groups. A Pew Research poll in 2015 found that the majority of millennials actually didn't like the millennial label. Time magazine ran a cover story in 2013 called Millennials, the Me, Me, Me generation, that put a slightly more positive spin. The advances in technology have empowered individuals by giving them the resources to compete against larger organizations. Think hackers versus corporations, YouTube creators versus traditional studios, app makers versus entire industries. Millennials may not always respect authority. It's not that they resent or rebel against it. They just don't always feel that they need the institution. To them, the world is more flat in terms of hierarchy. They're optimistic, they can be entrepreneurial, they're better informed, and they're willing to challenge convention to find a better way to do things. They're the most ethnically diverse generation. They grew up in an electronic-filled, online, socially networked world. They've been exposed to a diverse array of marketing techniques and tend to be much more skeptical of them. Social media and sharing, or sometimes oversharing of information, is natural. And as I showed before, they're more ethnically diverse and therefore likely more tolerant of difference. All right, I guess this one didn't have a, oh, there we go. So Angie considers top values in the workplace to be loyalty, strong work ethic, steady career path, and compensation. She most likely identifies with which generation? Homeland generation, Millennial generation, Generation X, the baby boomer generation, or the silent generation? Okay, good job. So workplace attitudes. Baby boomers value loyalty, work ethic, a steady career path, and compensation. Generation X, there's a transition to an improved work-life balance with a heightened focus on individual advancement, stability, and job satisfaction. The Millennials show emphasis on producing meaningful work, finding a creative outlet, and have a preference for immediate feedback. The introduction of social media has augmented some collaborative skills and created a preference for a team-oriented environment. Millennials expect free flow of information and have a strong connection to their supervisors and like frequent feedback. They're more likely to seek aid or benefit from their advisors or mentors, and this creates a more flat work environment. They do expect more of a balance of personal and professional life, and there is a greater divide between the baby boomers, who are a more work-centric generation, and the subsequent two generations. There's a shift towards public service, emphasis on volunteering and social responsibility, but we also have the idea in school and sports that everybody gets a trophy, and so this may lead to unrealistic expectations in the workplace. Being raised in an environment of constant praise and reinforcement, they expect that to continue in their adult life. So understanding millennials create an atmosphere of inclusiveness through transparency and ongoing dialogue. They expect transparency in the consumer workplace, and they're expecting it in medicine as well. There's a willingness to question authority, Generation Y. They want to be part of something, have a voice, and be heard. They would rather help solve the problem than be told the solution. Can you go to the next question? So the number of practicing urologists in the US under the age of 45 is a lot higher than the number of urologists over the age of 65, about the same as the number of urologists over the age of 65, or a lot lower than the number of urologists over the age of 65. Okay, so it's actually two, it's about the same. So here's a pie graph that kind of shows that. According to the most recent AOA census data, there are just over 12,000 practicing urologists in 2016. Females make up 8.5% of the urologists in practice, but under the age of 45, almost 20% of urologists are female. More young urologists have fellowship training than the previous generations. And if we look at practice demographics by gender, females are more likely to go into academics and less likely to join independent urology groups. So similar to the last slide, there are fewer young urologists overall going into independent private practice. Mike kind of pointed this out earlier than the previous generations. Why is that? Do they prefer employment? They want a guaranteed salary? Is loan repayment an issue? Are they less entrepreneurial? Or is it just a lack of exposure to private practice and business training? So if we look at millennial urologists, females especially are much more likely to be employed physicians. So what changes do we see as the millennials enter the urologic world? There's a greater reliance on technology. Next generation is accustomed to having information at their fingertips. When confronted with a question, they'll just Google it rather than write it down and go look it up later. And because of this, the practice of medicine is no longer limited to the content and knowledge of the individual physician. Social media is definitely here to stay. This is the third urology conference I've been to this month, and the prior two each had a talk about social media in urology. There are several websites for physician dialogue that exist, as well as Facebook groups. So recruiting millennials, how do they look for jobs? They look in the traditional platforms, hospital websites, online job postings, and recruiters, but they also use social media and word of mouth. And with social media, the network is much wider. They research a lot online using search engines, social media, rating sites, whether those are good or bad, and a lot of it they're going to just do from their phones. So they're used to transparency in the consumer world and don't know not to expect it. In the medical world, especially when it comes to things like insurance and billing, is about the least transparent industry, except for maybe politics. But it's important to be upfront about compensation and expectations. So discussing ownership opportunities early and being clear, be authentic, let your true culture, people, and brand show through. Also consider, how do you stand out from other groups or hospital systems? What makes you different? If you don't know, it's a good question to ask. And if you're not finding what you need, revisit your recruiting strategy. There are challenges in recruiting urologists, especially into independent urology practice. Student loan debt has doubled in the last 15 years, and when I talked to some current residents, I was hearing numbers more like $300,000 of student loan debt. With a change in work hour limits during residency and increasing education on burnout, as well as exposure to older physicians through training or family, millennials want more flexibility. And this can lead to a mismatch in goals. Millennials can be viewed as a bunch of lazy kids who aren't as dedicated and don't want to work as hard versus, I want a rewarding career, but I don't want to be as overworked or burned out as you seem to be. So I spoke to a bunch of residents nearing graduation currently about their thoughts, and these were some of the things that they said. They're concerned with the preconceived notion of millennials and who they are. Work-life balance is important, but most don't want to be employed or a shift worker. They feel confident they can make a good living as a urologist, so money is not necessarily the first factor they consider. They view themselves as innovative. They want to bring new ideas and a fresh perspective. They're interested in utilizing technology. They want to have a voice and opportunity for a seat at the table, but they feel like they don't understand the business of urology, especially private practice. Physician turnover rates increasing. The highest seems to be between the second and third years in practice, and this can be as high as 20% in small groups. Assigning a mentor when you bring in a new physician and an extended onboarding process of a year or more has been linked to lower turnover rates. And turnover does increase with mismatch between culture and the individual expectations. And so it's important to be clear about those expectations and to give feedback regarding compensation, RVUs, quality measures, patient satisfaction, and leadership opportunities can help with retention. So this was part of the drive behind Young LUGPA. Our goals are to increase diversity, to attract young members, explore the needs of early career urologists, enhance the practice of young physicians, including the transition into practice, facilitate the participation of young urologists in policy development and other activities of LUGPA, promote young physician leadership throughout the organization of LUGPA, and increase leadership opportunities for young physicians and train them for future leadership within LUGPA and within their own groups. So here are our committee members. Who are young LUGPA members? So they're 15 years out from fellowship or residency. They practice within LUGPA groups. We sent out some e-blasts last fall to help to try to identify some of the young members, and the last count I heard was 381 young urologists, but there's likely more out there. There are also similar efforts in other urologic organizations. The AUA Young Leadership Program, the regional sections are starting to show some interest, in specialty societies. And the goal of all of these is to identify young members, encourage them to get involved, and to provide value to them. So integrating the next generation, it's important to have transparency within our organizations and to help the younger generation understand the business of urology. Mentorship is key, both within the organization and beyond, and you can help by supporting and participating in young urology programming. This also offers opportunity for networking with potentially future people who might want to join your group. Leadership education is important, and I encourage you to look for opportunities to give young urologists a seat at the table.